Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Bitronistim. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Dan Diker, head of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Dan, let's jump into the topic that everyone's thinking about right now, the ICC arrest warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Gallant, what can you share with us about that?
Well, Moshe, I'm glad you jumped in to that issue first, because that was the moral disaster for the world in waiting for many years. We know that the ICC's warrant comes as the latest act of political warfare in a long series of acts of political warfare. We remember the ICC prosecutor Bensouda, who received in 2016 a complaint from the PLO against Israel and the United States, by the way, regarding the United States activities in Afghanistan, counterterror operations, as well as Israel's activities against the Hamas in Gaza. What a surprise. And here we are 8 years later, and the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. I mean, it's not diplomatic to say, but it's a very bad joke. Because if the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is the result of the 1998 Rome Statute, that was founded to arrest war criminals from countries that did not have viable, free, independent court systems. That was that reason that the ICC was founded. And here they're coming to one of the most democratically democratic, liberal democracies, free countries in the world, and calling for these ridiculous arrest warrants for our Prime Minister and Defense Minister. They might as well call for the arrest of every American president since 9/11. That would probably be consistent and proper, but maybe they're not doing it because they're not Jews. Don't know. But this is a combination of rank anti-Semitism and a rank erasure of Israel, and it should be condemned and vomited out by every policymaker, government leader that has any kind of moral clarity.
Absolutely. Do you think this has actually any fundamental impact on the way Israel is going to continue to conduct this war?
Absolutely not. I mean, it basically is a symbolic act of political warfare designed to further isolate Israel in the international community. The problem is that this is not the Palestinian-Israeli crisis, as so many people have wanted to brand the October 7th Iranian-backed mass murder, atrocities, kidnappings, torture, and rape, which is a war against the United States, Moshe. This is a war against the United States, Western alliance, and Israel together. Remember, and maybe there are ICC people watching the Bitronistim podcast, that they could learn something, that this war is the Iranian regime war that began in 1979, death to America first, death to Israel second, and it continues today. So if it requires people of moral courage and clarity to keep exposing the total moral hypocrisy of these international organizations, which I hope Israel and the United States working together, and I say this having just come back from Washington, D.C. just hours ago, that there is a disgust in Washington about these international organizations that they understand to be hotbeds of support for jihadi terrorism, and in which the free democratic world is going to need to pull together and punish and restructure these organizations to become the beacons of moral clarity and of international law that they were established to be by democratic countries, and are no longer those institutions.
Now, do you think that sending out these arrest warrants could develop into Israelis not being able to freely travel in Europe and countries that are bound by the ICC decisions, meaning, obviously this shouldn't prevent the Prime Minister from traveling to Washington, D.C., but could it spiral out of control for other Israelis in Europe? What do you think on that?
I think absolutely right. It sets a very dangerous precedent, not for the prime minister, but even though if the prime minister were to land in countries that are signatories to the ICC, he could be subject to arrest if unless they had government approvals. But what it does is it destabilizes the rules-based international order by making absurd decisions like this, and they make a joke out of themselves. But you're right. It establishes a precedent for other people, just like South Africa, by the way, right? South Africa is a signatory to the ICC, and what happens? There are already South African Israelis that have been subject to arrest in South Africa for being part of the Israeli army. So yes, it does create the precedent for people who live outside the 1967 green pen lines, or that are soldiers in the Israeli army. It paves the way for these types of possible cases, and people have to be wary.
All right, Dan, let me ask you a question on a little bit of a different topic. You've been in this space of advocacy for Israel national defense for quite some time now, and you were the head of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, but no longer, because you've changed the name to Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs.
Right.
If I got that correct. So can you explain to us what's gone through your head? How is your operation changed because of, I guess, what you see as necessary in the world of Israel advocacy?
Moshe, it's a great question, and we've been not only has it been going through my head, it's created a lot of headaches for the last number of years, because having worked at the Jerusalem Center for the former Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which had been established as a public affairs institute of the Jewish people along the lines of federalism, as envisioned and established by the great late Professor Dan Elazar, blessed memory, who saw the Jewish people as a federal concept. That's where the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs came from. But what we have done now in the last 2 years, since I had the privilege of taking over from former Ambassador Dr. Dori Gold, is to reposition, rebrand, and rename the Jerusalem Center, because what we do is engage in security alliances to strengthen Israel's security, together with Arab partners and allies in the Middle East and allies in the West. So the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs we see ourselves as a bridge connecting the Arab world, Abraham Accords and beyond, Israel and the West. And this type of alliance-based security is extremely important because of the fact, Moshe, that Israel is today the strong horse in the Middle East, as the Arab Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun discussed in the 14th century, and the great Lee Smith of Hudson Institute and other Washington very important think tanks, a great thinker today. He wrote a book called The Strong Horse a few years ago that basically referenced Osama bin Laden's use of the term in 9/11, by the way. And Osama bin Laden said that if there were strong horses or weak horses, he would always go with the strong horses. The idea being that in the Arab Muslim world, historically, history develops as cycles of violence in which strong horses replace weak horses. That's how Ibn Khaldun has seen Arab Muslim history then, and that's how Osama bin Laden continued that tradition. And today, using their own nomenclature, using their own historical points of reference. It was an article that, as you noted, that I wrote for the Jerusalem Post just some weeks ago, which is accessible on Google, that argued that today, specifically since the the beeper countermeasures that wounded so many Hezbollah, Iranian-backed Hezbollah terror operatives, several thousand, by the way, and that triggered a shift in Israeli strategy from defense and containment to victory and prevention. This has really re-centered Israel on the Middle Eastern stage as the strong horse. It's clear from our Persian experts at JCFA that the Iranian regime, beginning with Ali Khamenei, is terrified about Israel and its capabilities to strip away the Iranian air defenses and even hit a very sensitive nuclear installation that was just revealed just days ago, as well as having taken out Iranian-backed Hezbollah and Hamas command structures and leadership. We did all of that in a matter of weeks, and it shocked and awed, to use former General Schwarzkopf, Norman Schwarzkopf term from the first Iraq War, America war on Iraq after 9/11. We are in our 9/11 moment now that has continued for the last 14 months, and finally Israel has become the strong horse in the region. And America, by the way, as we've heard ourselves through the Arab and Iranian regime media, is very, very concerned about the strength and the unpredictability of President-elect Trump, which is a good thing in the Middle East. So here you have, this is, in that context, we paid attention to the developments in the region. October 7th was a watershed moment. We've moved from diplomacy-based security to security-based diplomacy. We are in a security era right now, where Israel, as a small state the size of Maryland, is being attacked on 7 fronts by Iran and its proxies, and any sort of day after. This is again to underscore the shift in name and brand and positioning of the JCFA, that anything that will come the day after will be based on Israel's vital existential security requirements in order to survive in this very unstable and fragile Middle East. So it's alliance-based security between the East, the Arab East, and the West, and security, what's called security-based diplomacy, which really should be music to the ears of the great Amir Avivi and your entire team at IDSF, and something that aligns both of us very, very closely in our approaches to the Middle East and the West.
Absolutely. At IDSF, we do a lot of security-based diplomacy. So it's super important, and we've seen tremendous results as we've shared now and then on these briefings. And Dan, I want to thank you for sharing that idea of the strong horse. It's a fantastic article. I put it in the Zoom chat. So everyone who's watching this briefing live on the Zoom, you can click on that link to see the article. And if you're watching this briefing on YouTube, you can catch the Zooms live by going into the description on the YouTube, and you can click to sign up for these live Zoom briefings. You can be more active. You can send in your questions and engage with these discussions. Dan, let me ask you a question. This whole concept of the strong horse in the Middle East, do you think that the US and the West recognize the role of the strong horse?
It's a very complex question, which is why I hesitated for a moment before answering. The outgoing administration is a continuation of the Obama administration's policy, not of the strong horse, but of, I would say, leading from behind, which was President Obama's term for their international relations, which is perceived as being the weak pony, not the strong horse. And that has been the terrible mistake that U.S. foreign policy has climaxed in. I think part of the pathway to October the 7th was a combination of Israel's misreading and ill-advised policies at the top level of containing radical Islamic groups like Hamas, when they had no intention of being contained and had every intention of dominating and winning this asymmetrical war. The American policy of appeasing Iran, which is exactly what former President Obama tried to do by engaging Ali Khamenei directly, in their view as the weak pony, in which they saw the Iranian regime as the answer to instability and terror in the Middle East. Let's remember that there was cooperation between the Iranian regime on the face of it and the U.S.-led Western alliance in opposing and trying to kill off the ISIS, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS operatives, which ultimately the United States did. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. They did not understand that Iran is ISIS with a huge empirical state attached to it. Look, let's face it, the great Dr. Harold Rode, who was one of the great political culture experts on Iran and a fellow at the JCFA, together with the great Dr. Dave Wormser, who was the Vice President Cheney's man on Iran and the Middle East back in the 8-year Bush 43 administration, have pointed out that the only way for the United States to win, and they can win, is by being the strong horse and getting away from the containment theory against radical Islamic operatives. Israel learned the lesson, and so did America, I think, on October the 7th, which again was a war on America over Israel's southern border. It was not only a war against Israel, it was a war against the United States and the West, continuing the Iranian regime's full-blood assault and kidnapping of 52 American hostages in 1979, holding them for 444 days, murdering 241 American servicemen and women in 1983, that had been dispatched by none other than the Reagan administration to help the PLO escape from Beirut to Tunis. Look at all these misunderstandings in the past, even though President Reagan, of course, defeated the Soviet Union, but in terms of Islam, the PLO, they misunderstood it, and that the policy of containment and being the nice guy, let bygones be bygones, simply does not work in the Middle East. And I think the Trump administration understood that they understood that very well in the first term. They leveled unprecedented, crippling sanctions against the Iranian regime, basically causing the regime to go broke, beginning to trigger a pathway towards regime change. They, at the same time, kicked out the PLO from Washington, rightly so, for being a terrorist supporting organization. And they also, moving the U.S. embassy not only as a real act, but its symbolism, moving it to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, recognizing Israel's application of Israeli law in the Golan Heights, and taking a very aggressive, rules-based, moral clarity policy is what works in the Middle East. And finally, America's assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the number one Quds force, Iranian Revolutionary Guard force, foreign arm, terrorist operative leader. He was assassinated, eliminated by the American drone. And everyone told the Trump administration, don't do it. It's going to ignite the entire region. It's just another confirmation of the point of your question. Nothing happened. Quiet, silence of the lambs across the Middle East. And that is, I think, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the response by the Middle East, including Iran, which attacked American interests, by the way, immediately afterwards. But it actually created quiet and I think enhanced the moderation that the Abraham Accords that came months later would reflect to us.
I want to ask you a completely different type of question, something we were speaking about before we went live, which is Qatar. You have a piece actually on the relationship now between Hamas and Qatar, and you mentioned about the B-52 bombers from the Pentagon being sent over. What can you share with us on all of that?
Well, it's clear that the United States is, I think, far more aware today that the Iranian regime is determined to dominate the Middle East and dominate the rest of the world. That is their own declaration. The United States has played an unclear role between helping Israel defend itself and taking a more active and aggressive role against Iranian belligerency. We see in the last couple of weeks, Moshe, we watched American jet fighters bombing Iranian interests in Syria. They're taking more aggressive actions in the Red Sea. And I think that the cognitive warfare by displaying publicly the B-52 bombers that are sitting in the America's military base in Doha is an indication, as well as the presence of a number of nuclear and other aircraft carrier major naval assets in the region, that America could provide a credible military response that would be more offensive than defensive. The administration, the outgoing administration, has not taken that decision yet. They're waiting to see what Iran will do. It is a fair assessment to think that Biden would want to leave his legacy as a man that did not go the way of Obama, but that really set the Iranian regime back by taking aggressive action against the regime in the coming weeks. It's unclear if that's going to happen, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility or fair assessment that he would want that to be his legacy, as opposed to Kamala Harris as his legacy.
That would be wonderful, and would pull up the timeline of things that we're waiting for here in Israel. You were just in DC, as you mentioned. Final question, then I'll let you go. And I very much appreciate your time and answering all these questions, sharing your expertise with our audience. Final question, you were just in DC. What is your sense on the ground of the pessimism or optimism, the alliance building sense in DC right now for everything that we need in Israel?
The sense in DC is one of optimism, relief. We spent some time with former senior Trump administration officials from the first term. And there is an understanding in a number of roundtables that we held with American political, Jewish, and other defense operations, that whether it's the RJC with whom we met, and we met with Jewish Policy Center and the great Shoshana Bryan, and the Zionist Organization of America, and several think tanks in town. And there wasn't their agreement, much to my relief, that we face right now an Iranian regime war on America. October 7th was the latest installation, the latest episode of the bloody commitment and declaration by the Iranian regime to kill off America's presence in the Middle East forever, and to destroy Israel as a reflection of its war on America. Not that death to Israel comes first. Remember, it came second in '79, and death to America still comes first today. They understand that our joint mission is to counter this Iranian war on America and Israel, and that's the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. That is really our flagship goal. Is to do that in partnership, again, fusing our friends in the Arab world, who very much are pro-America, and many of them, by the way, in the region that we're hearing, Moshe, beyond the Abraham Accords, are very much waiting for a Trump administration to come in. They much more respect American power, and I would say the unpredictability of President Trump is something that actually speaks Middle East, and it's something that the Middle East respects. And what we're trying to do, the JCFA, is to harness the power of alliances between the moderate Arab East, Israel, and the West, in order to fight and ultimately win this war against the Iranian octopus that is destabilizing not only the entire region, but also the West. It tried to assassinate President Trump. It tried to assassinate former Trump officials. It is penetrating through the southern border. sending thousands upon thousands of terror operatives from Latin America that are Iranian-backed. So this is a global problem. And they accept that concept that we presented, that this is a global problem, and it requires an American-led, Israeli affiliated counter initiative in order to win this war.
Dr. Dan Diker, you brought us good news today, a lot of optimism. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And thank you for the really important work that you are doing. I hope I can invite you back to join these briefings in the future.
It would be an honor. I'm a big fan of what the IDSF does, and I hope that the JCFA and the Beat Buddies team do a lot of things together where we comp one another very well. And I think that we really need to lead this war against our common enemies and win it finally.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.